Hi, this is Misha, and I'm back with more Mosins. This is Finn Rifles Part 2. We're going to start to look at some of the really major changes and upgrades. So, to begin with, we have the Army's M27. Then we have the Civil Guards. This is an original M28. Probably looks quite similar. And finally, for today, we have the more famous M28-30. Probably the best of the bunch on the table. Also from the Civil Guard, as you might have guessed by the name. As I said in video 1, TIC has started to tool up for barrel production in the mid-1920s, which was around the time that the Army really thought about what to do for the future. The M91 Mosin served fine, but it had its shortcomings. It really wasn't accurate enough. The sights really weren't up to Finnish standards. It was pretty long, cumbersome, and of course as older guns wore out, they knew they'd have to do something. They were already getting new barrels from Switzerland, Germany, and eventually making them domestically. So while you're making new barrels, which is pretty much the heart of a Mosin, at least to the Finns, why not? Basically, two ideas were floated. First, just keep upgrading the Mosin like they've been doing with the M91. Or make a whole new design for Finland, make a whole new bolt action. Obviously, the whole new design, being domestic, was more appealing, but it was also vastly more complicated, expensive, and time-consuming. On the other hand, just upgrading the Mosin incrementally, while cheaper, the ultimate results would have been meh. So, a compromise was hit upon. Essentially, they wanted to radically modify the Mosin, almost turning it into a whole new gun, but still basing it on the Mosin action, receiver, bolt, magazine. And they would only make about 120,000 using existing Mosin receivers, issuing these to frontline troops, and giving reserve troops the older M91. While this may not have been everyone's favorite solution, it seems to have been reasonably well accepted. And that's where the M27 arose from. So what have we done here? Well, first off, the big difference, we're using the heavy profile barrel, but we're shortening it from 31 inches to about 26. So the overall length drops from 51.5 to about 46.5 inches. So almost half a foot. So we're really chopping the length, although honestly weight-wise, because of the heavier barrel, we're not really, To go along with it, we have a new front sight with protective ears, kind of dog ear sights. The rear sight is still the Russian style, but we have upgraded it. We still have that 150 meter battle sight. We've also, let me flip it around, added 2 screws in the back. We've also added these little legs to it for better support. See? Still a split bridge type sight. So we've further upgraded the rear. We've gone to a new style of nose cap. Now ignore these popsicles for a minute. Originally they weren't there. but we do have this hinge. The idea was we just drive out one pin and we can remove this or remove the upper handguard without having to do like on a Mosin. And the reason we no longer have a stepped barrel is now we have this new bayonet lug down here. So we have a new pattern of bayonet lug, taking a knife, a puka type bayonet now. We've further refined the trigger with a added spring, reworking it. The bolt has actually received an interesting upgrade. If you look here, you'll see this little protrusion there. It is mirrored on the left side. Essentially, these are little wings that go into the receiver. And the idea was to stabilize the bolt. Finally, we started to do away with the dog collar slot, and we've gone to this 360-degree rotating swivel, which was hoped to help keep the sling from binding. Tikka would tool up and make about 800 barrels in 1927. And these would start to be fielded in 1928 and officially accepted into service at that time. Assembly was done at AV1, AV2, and AV3, with primary assembly at AV1 for the Army. This was strictly speaking an Army gun. The older M91s were used both by the Civil Guard and the Army, but the M27 was strictly Army. 28 was a relatively large production year. This is a 1928, for example. Interestingly, 29, they basically didn't make any. And they started to field these. The M27 has a very storied history. By 1934, they actually halted production. There were some major issues. To keep in mind, this was Finland's first attempt at really making their own design. If it wasn't from the ground up, there are a lot of new elements. The big problem they were having was because of this new bayonet lug, during either bayonet practice or just even firing the weapon with the bayonet attached, this forearm was splitting. This was because originally it was just a standard Mosin forearm hogged out for the heavier barrel. Also, those really nifty wings on the bolt weren't really great in practice. They didn't really do anything, and they had a few consequences. For one, you couldn't use this type of bolt in other Mosins. It can only be used in an M27 because you had to have the cutouts in the receiver. Of course, regular M20 Mosin bolts would fit, so a lot of times they get swapped out. But a bigger problem was that little recess in the receiver was only one direction. It just went in and stopped. So that bolt could compact dust, mud, dirt, snow, ice into the receiver, and if too much got in there, you could not close your bolt. It would get in and hit that debris and could not fully go into the receiver, and there was not a great way to clean it out, at least not in the field, because there was no like relief hole or anything. So they actually dropped that feature, the wings, really early. Around 1933 they stopped appearing. I did have a 33 M27 once that had the wings, but I've also seen them without the wings. But then again, you never know when they were removed or replaced, because it's just that this connector, the bar down below. So they would stop production in 1934. At that time, the Army had about 49,500 in inventory, so still less than half of the projected 120,000. And what they came up with were a few simple changes. They added these 3-inch metal reinforcement popsicles. The original screw here for the front band was retained, so it's under the popsicle. And then a secondary screw was put back here to strengthen the whole arrangement. They also started going to a new, heavier stock. You'll see the splice right here. This is where the two-piece stock arose, making unique forearms for these critters. Heavier dutier. They would also make the handguard a little different, a little heavier. The rear stock again could either be an original Mosin stock or a newly made one later on. And these changes they felt would improve the gun. So production, while low, was started again in 1935, but it was kept low through about 1938. They just made a few thousand during those years. Also, they ordered that all older, previously made guns, so the 50-some-odd thousand that were around, needed to be upgraded with the new forearm and popsicles. Even though this is a 1928, that's why it has those. Interestingly, they did not remove the wings on the bolt. That wasn't a requirement, so they left them on some earlier guns. And the refurb program didn't start really going full swing until about 1937. Now, one unique feature of M27s, and one that really makes me like this gun, aside from the fact that it was given to me by a friend, is this side sling mount, sometimes referred to as a bicycle or ski trooper swivel. It lets you sling the gun across your back on its side. Not all, even most guns had these, and these would appear in the 1930s. So obviously this one was given a new spliced forearm and was probably added at the time. It's just inserted in the original front slot with a keeper here that's oversized. So you can see how they did it. They just put it in the slot. Pretty neat though, I think. Well, in 1938, Russia was appearing more and more aggressive, and in the next video we'll get into the replacement for these guns, but most of you know it, the M39. So the idea was to take the M27 out of production by 1939 and replace it with a new, hopefully better rifle. Even with the upgrades, these guns still weren't as durable as they were hoping for. But most importantly, they weren't as accurate. For whatever reason, the M27 just never achieved the accuracy standards that Finland wanted. Just one of those things. The design was just kind of intrinsically not that accurate. I'm sure for someone like Russia, it would have been fine, but for the Finns, it just wasn't. So it was planned to be taken out of production, but the Winter War happened early. The M39 wasn't ready. So these were kept in production at both Tikka and VKT through 1940. Even after that, into 41-42, AV3 would continue to assemble some guns and refurbish older guns from leftover parts. It's worth pointing out that they did increase production in 39 and 40 for these. They made 1,500 and 1,300 respectively during those years. 1,300 may not sound like a lot for 1940, but keep in mind it was only done for about 4 or 5 months. So pretty large number for less than half a year. These were taken out of production, at least the barrels, but like I said, AV3 would make more. They would build a little under 1,000 from existing parts in 41 to 42, and more importantly, they would refurbish and repair about 4,000. So about 5,000 of these came back onto the battlefield for the continuation war and did continue to see use. Even if they weren't popular as some of the newer guns, they were still a good gun, better than a stock Russian Mosin, and would remain in the front line through 1944 and the end of that war. And I think the M27 is a really neat design. It's one of my favorites just for the wings and the kind of weird initial things they tried to do with it. Even if it never met its goals, it was still an interesting kind of first effort by the Finnish Army. And it will go without saying, but all of these are still chambered for 7.62 by 54 rimmed. by World War II, Finland was using a brass-cased 166 grain projectile, just FYI. Whereas Russia's standard was a 148 grain with a steel case, so a little heavier bullet. They were going for a little more accuracy. In fact, they often called it 7.62 by 53, just to kind of distinguish it. The Army was not alone in wanting a new and shorter gun. The Civil Guard did as well. I mean, the M24 was a step, but it wasn't that big of one. They obtained one or two M27 early production models, looked at it, liked a lot of the ideas, especially the length, but thought they could do better. And that's where the M28 Civil Guard rifle comes from. Like the M27, we have a 26-inch heavy barrel, giving an overall length of about 46.5 inches. We have front sight protectors, kind of curved in. The Civil Guard kind of nicknamed these the pointy dog-eared guns because of the floppy looking down at it, the kind of profile. We use the same bayonet lug, but the barrel band, as you see, is quite different. It's a split bridge. It's not the hinge type. All the stocks for these were cut down M91 stocks. The usual reworking of the trigger and bolt was done, but the bolt did not have the wings. That wasn't something they felt was necessary. The rear sight is still a modified Russian. They've got a plate on the back here with a new notch. There's also some small screws. There's a few different patterns of these, including a windage adjustable one. But basically the Russian rear sight, the curved style. And that's essentially your M28. It's basically just a shorter, heavier barrel with the sight protector. Originally, the Civil Guard contracted with SIG again in Switzerland in late 1927 for 10,500 barrels. They were in quite a hurry to get these, so they kind of placed some time constraints and incentives and penalties if SIG didn't get the order on time, but they did. They delivered the first batch in early 28, and I guess the Civil Guard was suitably impressed because they ordered another batch of 10,500 from SIG, and they received these in the spring summer of the same year. After that, they would order 11,500 from Tikka in Finland. At this time, Seiko was not able to manufacture barrels, but they were charged with making several small parts and doing the final assembly. So once they obtained the barrels from SIG or Tikka, they would assemble M28s, and these started to be fielded in mid to late 1928. They would essentially build these in series of four series. Between 1928 and 1932 as main production, and then assembling a few leftover guns up until 1934, even into 1935. Interestingly, in 1932, Seiko was finally ready to start trying to make its own barrels, and it kind of made I won't want to say a test batch. It was bigger and more important than that, but it made its first small batch of barrels to see how things worked out on a large scale of about 1,400 in that year. And so some late M28s could even have Seiko barrels. And they would do a little over 33,000 of these critters for the Civil Guard. Really, the production was only hampered by money. They had to kind of build a few and then wait for funding, and then build a few and wait for funding. So that's why there were 4 series, and it was spaced out over several years. This did prove to be a better gun than the M27. It did not have the issues with the stock splitting like the M27, even though it has a similar bayonet lug, and they were using modified M91 stocks. I guess just the different style of lug, or maybe the use they put them through, or whatever. It just held up better. It was also perceived as being more accurate. However, it was not without its flaws. And that's where the next rifle comes into the picture. So that resulted in this rifle here, the M28-30, possibly the most respected, if not necessarily the most well-known Finnish Mosin. This was, if not the culmination, a very big step forward. And where it began was an attempt to upgrade the rear sight. Up until this point, all these guns were using, to a greater or lesser degree, modified Russian curved rear sights that dated really back to the early 20th century. In 1930, a commission in the Civil Guard really looked at making a new style of rear, more modern sight. And this resulted in the first prototype, the M32 Rear Sight, which this was derived from. The original M32 Rear Sight was similar to this. I'm going to point this at you folks, but still a little different. It didn't have the split in the middle. It was a solid style, so Mauser. It only had one spring-loaded catch, not two. It only had notches on one side. It was adjustable in meters, none of that Arshins stuff. 100-meter increments, out to 1,000 meters. It was flat, that is one thing. Has these little protectors, as you see, for the rear sight. And then in 1933, a new pattern of front sight, developed by a different individual, but still in the Civil Guard, came in. It was based on the same dog-eared protector, but it was windage adjustable with a tool. And so the rear and front sights were kind of paired together and tested, and then they were upgraded a little bit or improved to make the Civil Guard happy. The rear sight is the one you see here. They added the split in the middle. They made it flip up now, where you can go out to 2,000 meters with it flipped up, or still at 1,000 with it down. They also made it in the white with blued numbers for easy recognition, easy visibility. The front sight, the adjustable windage, they liked, but the whole special tool thing, they thought, why not just make it a screwdriver? So they went to opposing screws for a screwdriver to adjust windage instead of a special tool. And both of these were tested in the field in 1933 and approved. And kind of the prototype, the early M2830s were from there. They continued to tinker with the trigger to improve it, and this does have a nicer feeling trigger than that M28. Originally, they were still using cut-down, modified M91 stocks. Bayonet lug is the same here, but they did go to a single-piece nose cap instead of the two-piece of the M28. They also tinkered with how they attach the barrel and how this interface to try to get a little better accuracy. And they changed the nut inside the stock here where the cleaning rod screws in. Pretty much by 1934, they had all these changes lined up, and these started to go into production. They were more or less built entirely by Seiko at this point, who was making barrels, but the furniture was still outsourced. And they did discover they needed a new pattern of upper handguard, because in the back here, sorry guys, the new flat rear sight required a new interface here, so they started making new upper handguards. Again, though, with Seiko doing final assembly. This would be about the time the older M28 was completely taken out of production. Now, interestingly, they started offering Civil Guard members the opportunity to send in their old M24 or M28 rifle and have it upgraded to the new standard. And there was kind of the Guard member had to pay for the upgrade, but they had a sliding scale depending on exactly how much work needed to be done. Obviously, all he needed was the new sights. That was pretty simple and relatively cheap. But if he needed a whole new barrel, that cost more. Or if his gun was just completely thrashed, they would basically scrap it and give him a new one, and that cost the most. So a number of rifles were sent in or upgraded, paid for by the Civil Guard members themselves. So quite a few of the older M28s were transformed into M2830s, and even some of the older M24s. By 1935, these were in full production, and as we talked about at the beginning of this video, the M27 was having issues with the bayonet, cracking the forearm. The Civil Guard took note. They didn't see this with their own guns, but just to be on the safe side, they started introducing a new two-piece splice stock with a thicker forearm in the mid-1930s. And also, Seiko started making some new rear sections with thicker wrists. So you'll see heavier, dutier stocks appearing in 1936, 37 in that time frame. They also reinforced the nose cap with the cross pin. Just again, they weren't really having trouble, but they didn't want to run into it later. These are very good, accurate guns, and they did not want to have them split. Plus, the Civil Guard didn't have the money like the Army, so they needed a good, reliable gun. And they had that in these. There's another little change they introduced late. They started dimpling the mag well back here to try to trap the rims of the casings and keep rim lock from happening. This rifle doesn't seem to have that change. I think it came in late 35. So obviously this doesn't have its original body, or it's just an earlier one that was made before that came in. Again, we have the same reworked trigger. We're still building them on original Mosin hex receivers, but later M2830s have new stocks, new barrels, highly reworked magazines, triggers, bolts. So very few untouched Russian parts are actually in these guns. They would continue building these and through 1940. Like with the M27, they planned to stop making these at Seiko and switch over to the M39. But because of the wars, these were actually kept in production until about 1941. They would build about 24,000 and a little under 24,500 of these. So actually fewer than the M28, but about 13,000 older M28s and M24s were upgraded to this. So now we're looking at about 38,000, and another 2,000 were actually made for the civilian private purchase market. So all told, we're about 40,000 of these, maybe a little less, 39, 40,000. So actually a larger number, with again the M28 numbers actually being decreased because of the upgrade. It's also worth noting that in 1937 there was an international shooting championship held in Finland, and the M2830 was selected for the Finnish team's rifle over the M27. This was mostly because of its better, more modern sights, more adjustable, but also it's just its reputation for accuracy and of course reliability. And by the way, Finland won the competition that year with this rifle. These are very popular during the Winter War for their durability and reliability and accuracy. They're almost de facto sniper rifles with very nice adjustable sights. And we'll get into episode 3. The Civil Guard was actually disbanded, and a lot of its property, a lot of its guns were turned into the Army. I only bring this up right now to say that after the wars, they counted and they had about 22,000 M28 30s in inventory. So almost half were lost through attrition, or destroyed in the war, or were just taken home by soldiers unofficially. So yeah, the survival rate for M28 30s was not great. Now again, I think a lot of them ended up walking home with soldiers because these were definitively more popular than the M27. The thing is, it's not a very different gun. I mean, the barrel length's the same, the barrel's virtually the same. The difference is really just in the sights and its reputation. I thought we would just lay out the Civil Guard rifles, kind of do a little short comparison now that we've gone through all the history and whatnot. And also, these are 3 versions you didn't see in the primary part of the video. Here we have a relatively, well, mid-production, early mid-production example of an M24, 9124. Pretty well, as you see, standardized Russian, just has a little bit of mods to this stuff. The stock is the thicker stock. It does have the hangers. A lot of the M24s did not. And of course we have the very distinctive stepped barrel. This one is a German contract barrel. This actually came from a friend recently. He says it's a good shooter. Probably is. But this is the full length, of course. Next up, got another M28 to show you. This is actually a very late production. M28, only a few thousand were made after this one. This is honestly getting into kind of the transitional period. See, it's still got the Russian style sights, although they've been further modified to make them happy. We just have the sling slots in this one. One thing, it does have the later single piece and nose cap. I'm not sure if this was a later replacement, very well could be, or this could be getting into the transitional period when they started using late style parts before getting to the 2830s. This does have the early style special tool adjustable front sight, as you see. And of course this is of the shorter length. This is a 46-inch overall gun. So this is when they've started to go to the short ones. Well, shorter. And finally we have another 2830 for you. I wouldn't say this is a late production example, but it's quite a bit later than that 28. I think 1937 was the year on this one. It has the all-new pattern of rear sight. Very finely adjustable. You can use, you got the coarse adjustments on the right and the fine ones on the left, so you can squeeze this in and adjust away. This would later be used on the M39 in slightly modified form. This does have the HV marked, flip it over, magazine. It is dimpled. The dimples are actually above the wood line towards the top. They did that, as I said, for reliability. But of course you can't see it, and I'm not going to disassemble it. This does have the reinforcing pin they added to the forestock. Whereas, like I said, with the M27s, they added those popsicles. This is what the Civil Guard did to strengthen Even though they really didn't have issues with this type of barrel band, the single piece leading to cracking, they still put a pin in on some. See, this has the tool adjustable screwdriver updated front side. Sling slots. Pretty well standard otherwise. And these had pretty nicely worked over triggers as well. Nice triggers for Mosins. So yeah, the 3 generations, 24, 28, and 2830 of the Civil Guards before they started sharing the M39 with the Army. Well, that gets us through the first generation of the shorter length guns by the Army and the Civil Guard. Obviously, both the M27 and the M28 were not without their issues. The Civil Guard went to this one to upgrade it. The Army would actually wait a little while, but we'll get into that next time. Anywho, if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them below. Also, any stories you have about your own Finn guns, again, we really welcome them. We like talking about personal stories. If you like the video, as always, we'd appreciate it if you'd click like. Also, you might check out our Finnish playlist and the rest of the episodes in this series. And if you'd like to really help support the channel, we'd appreciate it if you'd at least go over and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha. And we'll ski ya next time.